as Professor Ebenezer Obadare talks about the recent spate of coups, as he mentioned. I want to let you know that the Kansas African Studies Center has a full slate of programming. I'm not going to say much about it now, except to direct your attention to the chat where Charlotte, our communication coordinator, is going to be posting some links to our events. I will particularly note, though, the other sessions in the Ujamaa Virtual Colloquium series. On October 10th, we have Dr. Emily Riley from El Colegio de Mexico, and she will talk about Welcome to the Teranga Republic, Women's Politics in Senegal. And then on November 8th, we have Dr. Merve Fujula from the University of Missouri, who will be speaking on political economy of West African republics from 1840 to 1920. And today, we're kicking off the series with a good friend and colleague of the Kansas African Studies Center, Professor Ebenezer Obadare, who is currently the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm not going to take any more of his time, but will instead ask you to join me in welcoming him for his presentation on the Marshall Turn in African Politics, Origins, Dimensions, and Implications. Professor Obadare, over to you.
Thank you, my friend. Good to be back at KU. I've been following KU football, and happy times, huh? So let me just say a couple of things about what I'm going to try and do this afternoon. The turn in the Marshall turn could be the return, and you'll still be right. Because basically what I'm trying to talk about is why we've had 8 coups d'etat and attempted coups d'etat in West and Central Africa over the last 2 years. What's going on? What's the nature of the problem? What's the best way to frame it? And what does the future hold? And believe it or not, I'm actually going to end on a very optimistic note. But what I think, the first thing I would like to say is that, and I hope you get a sense of this from either reading the two prep articles that I asked Professor Adams to circulate, or from reading my blog on the Africa in Transition deck, or maybe my work generally. And it's that for me, when I observe the phenomenon of military intervention in Africa, it's very personal for me. I grew up my teenage years and my early years as a professional journalist and as an academic in a Nigerian university. They were dictated marked by the soundtrack of military rule. You know, I mean, we used to have a joke then, like, if you say my fellow countrymen, you're like, oh, which general is that? Is that, you know, an infantry general that has taken over? So much of what I think about the military and how I think about the military has been shaped by that. So I was one of these. So in response to the coup in Niger, for instance, you know, back in July, you know, I wrote this piece for the Africa in Transition blog, basically asking for a Pax Nigeriana, asking that Nigeria lead ECOWAS in concert with Western countries to invade Niger and restore President Mohamed Bazoum to power. And, you know, I'm still unrepentant on that. I think in terms of logistics, that is no longer doable. We can talk about why that is no longer the case. But I think it's important for me to put on the table, I couldn't underscore more my disgust at military rule. And for me, when I talk about military rule, there's nothing theoretical about it. I did an NPR interview last week, you know, and I told the reporter, I said, look, when I think about military rule, it makes me think about the late Afrobeat star, Fela Anikulapo Kuti in Nigeria. He said, look, the only 3 things you're ever going to get from military rule: sorrow, blood, and tears. The jury is in on military rule in Africa. And I'm saying this as a preliminary remark because I'm going to come around to addressing some of the grievance, you know, the fundamental sentiment behind young people's embrace of Russia, of China, you know, wrapping themselves in the flag, anti-French sentiment and all of that, and popular embrace of soldiers who have come to power. All those things we can dive into all of them. But if there's anything that I want to take away, I want us to take away, that, or maybe to start with, is that I'm wired in a particular way, you know, against military rule. And it's because of my own intellectual and professional formation, and that's the sort of the foundation for everything I'm going to say, you know, in a moment. So It's personal for me. So in terms of framing, the way I want us to think about what's been going on in West and Central Africa over the last 2 years is that to think about it as the first concrete pushback against the so-called third wave of democratization. So you all remember late 1980s, early 1990s, there was just a rash of elections across. I mean, I think Huntington mentioned, I think about 60 countries, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. So Asia, it was a period of transition from various forms of authoritarianism to so-called democracy. So Africa was very much at the hub of that, and we all celebrated it. And I can say that as a person, as a young journalist at that time, I was, very much part of that process. So in order to understand what's going on right now, I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what happened at that time? Why the embrace of democratic rule and democratic process at that time? The first thing, and then I think this something that everybody knows, the collapse of totalitarianism and the victory for liberal democracy. The two books I think to read in this regard will be Václav Havel's book. I've taught, my civil society and the state class with the book, sort of the Bible of anti-authoritarian civil society, not just in the former Czech Republic, but across all the East European countries. And then, on a much more triumphalist note, Francis Fukuyama's book, which came out in 1992, The End of History and the Last Man. But both sort of indicative of the power of that moment, and the fact that this was a time when people were tired of statism, of authoritarianism. There was this, insofar as liberal democracy and centralized rule had been engaged in a bet, at the end of at the conclusion of the Second World War in 1945, 1989, and going forward was the moment that everybody felt that liberal democracy had won that bet. So that was the background to the third wave of democratization, that we saw in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And then with a further point is that with the retrenchment of statism, there was this renewed interest at the same time in civil society. And I say that again as somebody who has not just contributed to that literature, but also part of agitating for an expansion of the public sphere in different African countries. I started my civil society book by actually talking about the moment in my journalism career that I had an encounter with the journalist from AFP, who asked me, all of these things you guys are doing, you're in your early 20s and all of that, what does it mean for civil society? I didn't realize I was doing anything on behalf of civil society. We just felt that somebody had won an election, the military had cancelled it, the right thing to do was to take to the street to try to restore democracy and remove the military from power. So that was the moment, I became acquainted with the idea of civil society. I eventually did my PhD on the theory of civil society, and since then, most of my writings are focused, on the practice of civil society in Africa. But the final thing of that moment is that the failure of centralized planning, as marked by the decline of communist totalitarianism, also increased the impetus for economic growth and development. Again, not just in Eastern Europe, but in different parts of Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. It was a very early moment. If the idea of civil society was not in existence then, I think it would have been created. That's what the Comoros, John and Jane Comoros said, and I believe them. And it's a very interesting time to be a student of the public sphere, of democracy, and all kinds of things were going on. And there was a lot of hope invested that particularly in societies where elections had been defined by their reality, the routinization of elections was the first step that was going to be taken towards the consolidation of democratic precepts in many of these countries. So that was the storyline back at that time. And there is no doubt that Africa caught the bug. So listen to this. So between 1990 and 2015, a 15-year period, there were 184 multi-candidate presidential elections and 207 multi-party legislative elections in some 46 countries across Africa. So everywhere you turned, right, there was an election being held. You know, somebody was holding an election, a regional election, a national election, with all the usual retinue of election watchers, you know, the media, foreign media, international aid, everything. Everybody was having an election. So from being what I call the rarity, elections became routine. And you sort of had a sense that, you know, of what you might call a democratic ferment, a sense that things were going to change and that indeed, you know, things were changing. However, you know, behind the scene, even as elections were being held, something much more sinister, you know, much more sinister would now seem to, you know, to have been going on. So I will call people's attention to a paper I published in Journal of Democratization in 2011 on what I call the abrogation of the electorate in Africa. And I say that because, you know, what that paper does is, you know, to capture the then emerging trend, which has now become consolidated, of authoritarians using the instrumentality of elections to whitewash, you know, authoritarianism. So Africa was at the hub of that development, as I said earlier. Elections were being held over a 15-year period. All kinds of records were being broken in terms of elections being held. But when we now look back, and, you know, my friend and I, Wale Adebanwe, you know, we co-authored that paper. We sort of knew that something was afoot at that time, hence that paper. And basically what we're trying to tap into was this idea that behind all this facade of elections being held, something, you know, that was contrary to the ethos and the spirit of democracy appeared to be taking root, you know, almost at the same time. So giving back to, you know, so there are various names for this in the literature. Our Press of Britain will know this. You know, there's the reference to pseudo-democracies and dictatorial democracies and authoritarian democracies and dynastic democracies, everything but liberal democracy. So slowly but steadily, in hindsight, we can now see that during that period, you know, when democracy appeared to, you know, be at its peak, especially as indexed or as marked by this rush of elections, African dictators were mastering the art of using democracy, you know, to prolong one-man rule. So what does that, where did that get us? Let me read this paragraph to you because I think it's interesting just in terms of the numbers to illustrate, you know, what was going on. Since 1960, a dozen heads of state across sub-Saharan Africa have held office for more than 30 years. A further breakdown reveals that 5 sitting African heads of state, Equatorial Guinea's Mbasogo Nguema, Cameroon's Paul Biya, the Republic of Congo's Daniel Sassou Nguesso, Uganda's Yoweri Museveni, and Eritrea's Isaias Afwerki, respectively. These 5 guys have held office for more than 3 decades each. At the same time, more than a dozen other African heads of state have been in power for at least 10 years. Now, Mr. Paul Biya, currently 90, has held office since 1982 and is currently the oldest head of government anywhere in the world. So you have this on the one hand, you know, you look at 1990 to 2015, you say, oh my God, you know, the view from 33,000 feet, we're headed in the right direction. You know, elections are being held, power, quote and unquote, is changing hands. And then if you read what I've just read to you, if you take that into consideration, you remember, you sort of realize that none of that, you know, was going on. So naturally, this led to rumblings, you know, particularly among young people. And why is this significant? It's significant because Africa is the youngest continent, and whatever it is that young people are doing, you actually have to pay attention. Now, paying attention means we're asking, if those rumblings are being heard and they're getting louder, the question that begs is, what do young people want? As the data show, they're actually not asking for heaven and earth. They're asking for very doable things. Let me tell you a list of some of the things that young people in frustration started asking for. They want an end to the facade of electoralism without democracy. And then they want, you know, a generational turnover. They think older people have been in power for too long. and that those older people, the Bias of this world, the Sassou Nguessos of this world, you know, the Mbasogos of this world, the Afewokes, Museveni, and all of that, that they should hand over power to younger people so that the continent can be restored to a path of economic vibrancy. So that's one thing that is common to young people's agitation in different parts of Africa. Second thing, educational opportunity. I've written about this. You know, I did a piece for Current History last year where I was talking about, I think early this year, where I was talking about the state of Africa's Nigerian universities and colleges. Every year, 20,000 researchers and PhD candidates leave Africa. They're leaving because the situation in those universities is dire. And they're absolutely right. I used to teach in a Nigerian university. I know exactly what they're talking about. I left Nigeria in 2001. Compared to what the state of those universities now, that will now seem to look like a golden era. But things have really, really deteriorated. And this is not just a Nigerian story. You know, you're talking about Zimbabwe, you're talking about, I think Ghana is still more or less, you know, but even though people are fleeing Ghana, but I think if you look at West Africa, for instance, you know, Ghana sort of managed to have, you know, a decent run, being able to hold things together. But the picture, the global picture across the continent is very, very discouraging. So that's the second point. Young people want better access to quality education. As I'm speaking to you, young people are organizing strikes at the University of Lagos in Nigeria, at the Obafemi Awolowo University in Ife, and I think at the University of Ibadan, and they are protesting against a hike in university tuition fee. So that's there. A third thing that young people are asking, they want investment in physical infrastructure. They want internet to be accessible and to be reliable. They also want power. As I'm speaking to you, the power grid in Nigeria has collapsed, and there is no place in the country that has electricity. But you would think, wow, that's a disaster. Well, it's a disaster only when you keep in mind that this happened 8 times last year. Then the power grid in Nigeria collapsed 8 times in 2022 alone. So what does this all mean? Why does this matter? It matters because these are the deficiencies, the material deficiencies, powering young people's, you know, fueling young people's frustration. Young people are dialed into the world, connected to the world through social media, through TikTok. They know what it's like to be young in London. They know what it's like to be young in Nebraska. They mentally, they are part of those communities, but they realize that those aspirations can't be met because the so-called democracies that they've been experiencing in different parts of the continent are not delivering what is called the material dividend, you know, of democracy. So in case you are wondering, why are young people embracing coup planners and soldiers in Mali, in Niger, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso? Are these people crazy? No, they're not crazy, right? My argument has always been, and if you read my Wall Street Journal article, that's exactly what I'm saying, that you should listen to them because what they are saying is this: we don't see any moral difference between soldiers in power and civilians in power. So when President Ali Bongo said, you know, I'm sure you've seen the memes of him sitting in the basement and saying, make noise, you know, make noise. People are like, what are you talking about? What have you done for me lately? You only rigged an election last week, an election you should not have participated in because you wanted a third term in power, and you want me to protest on your behalf? So there's something very fundamental, very profound in young people embracing those soldiers. And my argument is they do not necessarily love the soldiers, even though there's a part of that worries me that I think we can talk about. But insofar as my reading is, they do not necessarily love the soldier. They're sending a very fundamental message about the fact that democracy in all these countries has not delivered, you know, for young people. But I need to introduce a caveat here, that when I talk about frustration with liberal democracy, you can see that this cuts across the entire world. right? I've lived in the United States now for, how many years? The last 5 years have been really, really interesting, right? Disgruntlement with democracy, people feeling that democracy is not delivering in terms of bridging socioeconomic inequality. This is not just an African concern. As a matter of fact, this is one of those areas in which developments in Africa anticipate and coincide with development in other parts of the world. So there's a report that came out, a couple of years ago by the University of Cambridge's Center for the Future of Democracy. And it estimates, based on data from across 154 countries, is that the number of individuals who are dissatisfied with the condition of democracy in their country rose by 10 percentage points from 48% to 58% between 1995 and 2020. But on a more disturbing note, right? So young people between the ages of 18 and 30 in the United Kingdom, 80% of them agree that having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections is a good way to run the country. This is the United Kingdom, right? This is not Africa. As a matter of fact, when you look at the data from Africa, it actually gives you more hope and more confidence. 85% of young people support freedom of belief, 75% plan to vote in upcoming elections, and large majorities continue to support doing more to address inequality and access to internet and infrastructure. So I wrote a piece about this a while ago, which I titled Theory from the South. And I'll start talking about the fact that if you look at the way in which people are positively disposed to democracy, it's interesting how you want more of something if you don't have it, right? That the way young people want democracy in Africa, it contradicts the mood, the pessimism in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in parts of Western Europe, where people have had liberal democratic regimes for so long, and there's this sense of ennui about what it can and cannot do. But that's not even the end of the good news when it comes to Africa. There's better. Let me read this to you. So think about what happened or what has been going on in South Africa. The arrest and imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma for contempt of court. From where I stand and my disgust at the era of big men, and you can't think of a bigger man than Mr. Jacob Zuma, the fact that the system brought him to heel and disciplined him, the fact that you are arresting an African president, I don't think people understand how big this is. Bringing him to justice, even though he's tried to wiggle through and all of that, for me, it's one of the reasons why I remain hopeful about democracy on the continent and why I think we should all support materially, morally, efforts to boost institutions that reinforce democracy. Not just in South Africa, Zambia. There's an unexpected victory for opposition presidential candidate Ichilema, followed by the election of Nelly Muti as the country's first female speaker of the National Assembly. Again, that's good news. Remember the Kenyan election? It was supposed to be a bloodbath. Do you all remember that? They were all supposed to be killing each other with cutlasses, but that did not happen. Not only did Ruto win, his victory was challenged in the Kenyan Supreme Court, and the court ruled in his favor. The court upheld his victory. In 2020, high-level bribery attempts and threats were made against members of Malawi's Constitutional Court, but they held firm, and the 5 justices were awarded the 2020 Chatham House Prize in recognition of their courage and independence in the defense of democracy. Excellent news. Remember what happened back in 2015? President Goodluck Jonathan might have elected to drag things out in the court, he might have, deepened political suspense in the country. It did not. More recently, this last election, and here I'm going against the grain, right? Everybody is shouting doom and gloom about this last election. I'm in a minority. I keep saying, when you think in terms of the longue durée, this was a wonderful thing, for Nigeria. The Labour Party, whose candidate, Peter Obi, used to be a member of the establishment, tapped into this energy of young people, the so-called obedient, and they've made a largely fossilized 2-party system they've made it very, very competitive. They are not clear-minded enough to even see their own victory yet. But this happens to everybody. I think it's a matter of time. It's going to take years. They're going to see that they've actually done more damage to that fossilized system, that entrenched pseudo-democracy that many would have expected, So I see all of this to say that despite all the gloom and doom, I think that there's a lot to celebrate, when it comes to democracy and democratic consolidation in Africa. My final point will be for us to, when we think about young people's agitation for greater inclusion, for transparency, for free and fair elections, and for material improvement in their lives, this is actually a good thing, right? Because this is what democracy is supposed to be all about. Behind the seeming agitation for military rule is a deeper yearning for true democracy. If, like me, you're a student of power, of rule, of social movement, of civil society in Africa, the one thing that I'm going to take away from what has happened, despite this reversal constituted by the spate of military coups d'etat, is that the way young people have responded and some of the other positive examples that I've highlighted actually gives me hope that things are good, that the continent, broadly speaking, is headed in the right direction. I think also that for people between the ages of 18 and 30, and there was a foreign affairs piece, I did on this after the Nigerian election. I think part of what they are also about to get is their own first experience of what it means to have the military. My hope is that once the military begins to do what the military does in power, it will cure them of the optimism, of the hope they have in the military, and that they will come to our side of the divide, and they will all be able to unite around the idea of liberal democracy that is just, that is inclusive, and that delivers material prosperity for the people. I spent 30 minutes. I was going to do 20. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thank you. Thanks for listening. I hope that makes some sense.
Can you switch to panel question? Okay, we have people already sort of throwing their hats in the ring, hands in the air, voices out. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Prof.
Thank you, sir.
That's a brilliant presentation. I want to know, like, you already have a stand about the issue of ECOWAS invasion in Niger. So my question is, if we look at the aftermath, like humanitarian crisis and refugee crisis, so how do we intend to reconcile that at the end of the day? If eventually ECOWAS invades Niger, how do we reconcile the humanitarian and the refugee crisis?
Okay, thanks for that. The concern is legitimate, and this is not the first time I've heard that. My question is, my answer is very simple. There is already a humanitarian situation, not just in Niger, but across the Sahel. So you couldn't do any worse. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why France, to some extent, is pulled out now. It remains in Niger. It's been chased out of Mali and Burkina Faso and all of that. The United States has invested, considerable amount of money to support infrastructure, to rein in the insurgency and all of that. So all of which is to say that these countries are not exactly models of stability, where if you remove one thing, you're going to make life difficult for everybody. I totally get your point that if you militarily intervene, it's going to make life difficult for the people. But if that is going to be the hill you die on, then you have to be very careful. So because you're basically saying, if the military intervenes in Nigeria tomorrow, oh no, please don't do anything. Think of it, humanitarian emergency, lives are going to be made difficult. I don't want to come across as a hawk, but I believe that there's always a price to pay for something. And I was willing to pay that. Look, I've paid that price as a person. I grew in my 20s, in Nigeria in the 90s. I was an underground journalist. I had friends who were killed. This is not a theory for me. This is not theoretical for me. So I understand what you're saying, but I don't want us to sort of box ourselves into this situation where we think if we dare move against the military in any place, if we dare do anything in support of democracy, then we shouldn't do it because, people are going to lose connection to electricity. People are going to not have water. I hope I'm not coming across as insensitive and harsh, but I just think that there is always a price to pay for a move like this, and it's a move that I defended at that time. I no longer think there should be military intervention, not because I've abandoned that principle, but because I think that the strategic situation has changed, and the junta of Abdurrahman Chiani has entrenched itself. But I want you to think about it. Anyway, that's where I stand.
Yeah.
Before we move to the second question, let me make one request of people who are joining us online. If you could please, in the chat, indicate where you're sitting as you're listening to us. We're trying to get a sense for where people are joining us. So if you don't mind saying hello and saying where you're joining us from, we'd appreciate that. More questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So what I found really interesting is you mentioned that for the civilians, there's really no difference in seeing the military in power and these people who have ruled for over like decades in power. From previous experiences, I mean, like we've seen that military rule hasn't really been beneficial for anybody. Can you see that changing in the future?
No, I don't. They then bring sorrow, tears, and blood. Then regular trademark. Go and listen to fella. Look, the jury is in on military rule. The constitutional role of the military and the thing for which ordinarily they are trained is to support the security of the country and to hold its territorial integrity. That's all. Soldiers were not trained to run the economy. Soldiers were not trained to. Military rule is an aberration, and it's insofar as I understand, and I hope you got that the energy from me saying, look, I understand the frustration, and that's why I was front and center with it. The solution to bad governance, to democratic deficit, is deeper democracy and good governance. It is never military rule, right? So I can already tell you what's going to happen in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. It already happened in Mali, by the way. One thing that military rule does is to stimulate intra-professional jealousy and rivalry. So one leader is there, is going to be knocked off by another leader, and then it becomes a game of musical chairs. But if you also read my, a second thing now, if you read my article on the rise of the gangster militariat, my argument there is that it illustrates one of the things that happens when you have the military in power for so long. Number one, it loses its professional confidence, it loses its direction, and it is degraded as an institution. So, which is why I say, look, if you look at the cohort of military rulers who took over at the first flush of independence in 1960, these were properly trained, they understood, the ins and outs of the English language or the French language, whatever. Look, and then, the majority said, oh, hold on, you have this lumpen militariat, badly trained officers, lower ranks and all of that, who succeeded them. And right now, there's what I'm calling the gangster military. Just look at Traore, right? Go look at the picture of Traore visiting Putin, right? Does that strike? He's a gangster. Look at the glasses, look at the gloves and all of that. You could imagine him dancing to Tupac and all of that. And I'm serious about this. There's a sensibility there that is anti-professional. The people of Mali Niger, Burkina Faso, they're going to get it. There is only sorrow to be had from military rule. You don't get anything positive from it. In fact, it's worse. While the military is in power, you lose out on the time to invest in building solid democratic institutions because it takes work. And this is one of the things why you also find in the United States right now that even for a democracy that has been in the making since 1776, you can see that, through all these slippages and feints and January 6 and all of that, you can see that even strong or consolidated democracies struggle. So you're now thinking about places that are under the auspices of the military, they have no chance. And the earlier the military were to leave so that the work of building democracy is to start, the better for these societies. Thank
we
you.
We have from Nelson, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ebenezer, for that kind of presentation. I quickly want to clarify things, and I will appreciate your position on them. During the earlier part of your presentation, you made mention of some economic uprisings as one of the reasons for probably political instabilities. You talk about poverty, you talk about a lot of things about Nigeria. Nigeria is a case study. My question is that, despite the serious abject poverty in Nigeria that you have said so far, so many things are not working, as made in your presentation, why have there been military coups since 1999 or thereabout? That's my first question. The second question is the fact that we know what happened in Libya in terms of foreign government interference in African governance. And based on some unfounded theories, we also know the politics behind Niger coup. We've had Russia interference. Of course, there are some stories that say European Union also interference. Is this kind of a power interest tussle behind that? I wanted to talk about foreign interference in African politics as one of the reasons for this instability. Citing Libya as an example, and of course Niger as an example. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Two questions. Why no military coup in Nigeria since 1999? I think I know why. I think you could, look, I think by 1999, the rump of civil society in Nigeria were resolved on one thing. Like, we've had enough of military. If you're a member of my generation, look, if you talk to anybody in Nigeria, late 40s, early 50s, they've seen enough. They've seen enough. No more soldiers. And I think that message sort of, right, it's radiated through the rest of civil society, the media, the trade union, because removing the military from power was done at such considerable material and emotional cost. Let me give you an example. So I worked for Tempo and the News. If you check out the history of those organizations, we were driven underground by the military. And there was a time when in that newsroom, before we were all scattered across the four winds, we were all people with at least 2 degrees, who wanted to write, novels and fiction. And like we were all on the up. And then we spent the better part of our youth struggling against the military. And, part of the tragedy of that is that every single one of us in that newsroom today is currently outside Nigeria. So that's a separate story. But to illustrate the point I was making about the emotional cost of military rule. And I think the point there is that we got to a point where for the country as a whole, I think one of the things that you also do when you have military rule is the military also exposes itself, right? The promise of military rule is we're going to fix things. Well, you've been in power for 10 years. Show me, Mr. Soldier, what have you fixed? People saw that the promise of delivery on the economy, like, okay, if as a matter of fact, when they promised to end corruption, what do we have? Look, if you would see the language I've used to describe General Sani Abacha, you see where I've come from. I describe him as venal and homicidal, and I'm understating it. Abacha stole more than $5 billion. He was the first Nigerian head of state right? To take a bullion van to the central bank and take money, right? So all of which is to say the military did something to all of us. The military delegitimized itself in the presence of all of us. So that's why, like, if you look, the worst of any democratic government, I'm going to have it, than to have military. And I think the point is that that's sort of settled among everybody in Nigeria. But you have beginning to have a breach. And if you look at what's happening among the obedient now, every now and then, remember, these are people under the age of 30 or thereabouts. They were not there in 1993, right? They don't have any experience of life under the military, hence the embrace of the military. This, to some degree, also applies to young people in Niger, in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, in Gabon. So that's the first part of the question. Foreign interference in African politics. This is where I'm going to disagree with most people. There are at least two sides to this, right? So if you look across the Sahel, there's anti-French sentiment, which I think is just to some degree. France has not always covered itself in glory, especially in its former French colonies, in its former colonies. Two, it's been very cozy, very, very, very body with the leaders. The latest example being the Gabonese, the family that has the Bongo family in Gabon. All of that is true. What I don't want us to then do is to blame African, Western countries or European countries for the problems of Africa. If you do that, you will be committing you will be basically depriving African countries of their own agency, right? What I try to do in my work is to balance both, to say, look, there is some responsibility to be assigned for a country like France, and we should, but at the same time, it's important that we continue to have an ambivalent relationship, at the very least, with those countries. So think about it. Where do our leaders go for their degree? They go to the West. When a Nigerian leader wants to boast, he says, I'm Harvard trained, I'm MIT trained. He never says, I'm University of Ibadan trained. Oh, when the president has a headache, do you know where he goes for medical exam? He goes to Western countries, right? Where do young Africans go when they don't have opportunities in Africa? They go to Western countries, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot there to unpack, but what I want to leave you with is this. Do not, if what you do is to continue to hold outsiders, the French, the British, the Americans, responsible for the problems of Africa, we're not going to have a stab at the solution, because we are going to, continue thinking, oh, if only those people could stop interfering in their lives, we are going to be fine. Experience, data, history, everything show that African countries are equal, African leaders are equally culpable for the problems of African countries, and that dimension of the problem should be addressed.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat.
Okay, we have a. Sorry.
No, it's fine. You can
Well, let me go to the question in the chat. So the question in the chat, I don't know if you can see it.
No, I can't.
How easy and soon can it be for these countries that have seen the junta to relinquish power to civilian rule? That is the question. How easy and how soon?
Okay, so I think I've partly addressed this. Look, there is no single part of there is no history of any military ruler anywhere saying, you know what, it's been 10 years, yeah. Where are those civilians? Let's hand over power to them. No, this is part of why I was explaining earlier to my friend who asked about why there has been no coups, there have been no coups d'etat in Nigeria since 1999. That you get to a point where people realize these people are not going to leave until you mobilize to drive them out. And the work of doing that, it costs blood. It's a lot of mobilization. People are going to lose jobs, lives will be taken. I was in Lagos on the day that Abacha shot 400 people. I remember walking home and seeing bodies. That's what you get for military rule. It's always lovey-dovey when they come in. Oh, we're going to change everything. Everything's going to be fine. All those things that civilians promise you, don't worry. We're going to do all of those things. They have neither the appetite nor the training to do those things. There's no incentive for them to hand over power because they believe that they are the ones who should be in power. And by the way, they have their guns that they can train on whoever opposes them. So I'm not hopeful at all. So in Niger, General Cheni has said that it's going to. So President Tinubu said, "Oh, would you hand over power within 9 months?" He said 2 years. And I was like, of course. Look, if there's a transition in Niger in 2 years, it will mean, mark my words, that the general is running for office and converting from military ruler to democratically elected president.
Bridget.
I don't know if you can see me, but okay. So I have two questions. Well, okay. One is a question and then one is a comment. I'm going to comment on the foreign interferences that you talked about because my research is on that. And I think you're right when you say the West cannot be blamed for all of Africa's problems. I really do agree with that. However, if we take Francophone West Africa, that is not necessarily the case because we have France that's still interfere in the political and economical systems of Francophone West Africa. Research shows that there is some sort of colonial tax that's being paid even right now, just so they can account for infrastructure that was built during the colonial period. So if all the money that you're making is being used to pay off something that happened a long time ago, if France is continuously getting involved in most of their political decisions and economic decisions, then they do have a role to play. They do have a responsibility to take. So I think I don't agree with you on that.
Let me quickly respond to that. You're giving France too much power, right?
They have power.
Look, let me give you an example. There are, until very recently, France had military bases in many of these countries. It's been forced to sort of, dial back. Ask yourself, and this is the same question this is the same thing I say when people say African countries are being loaded with debt. And I say, when you sign an agreement, right? So there is country A and there's country B. The agreement is written in a language that negotiators for A and negotiators for B understand. It's totally your fault if you sign up to terms that are not conducive to you, right? If France is basically screwing West African, its former colonies in Africa, I will focus on France. Absolutely, you should. But I will be more harsh in my judgment of those leaders. And I will ask the question, why do you continue to persevere in behavior that is utterly destructive of your economy? It's a legitimate question to ask because, look, if you are not careful, you are going to get yourself in a situation where you say, African countries have no agency, they cannot fix their problems. Oh, those who used to colonize them should come back and fix the problems they created. I'm sure that's not your position, but I'm going to encourage you to tread very carefully.
She has a question that she wanted to add to that. Sorry.
Usman wanted to add something.
Yeah, just to that, I think there's another angle of this, question would be by focusing always on French and the former French colony, we are kind of wasting energy and almost can lead to inaction. When do we take responsibility and not to still like the old people, old generation, or the colonization, or French, when do we depart from it and just to be in action and moving forward and stop kind of, just almost hitting, just like this thing on that. When do we move forward? When do we act really as, people, as young Africans, for instance, I feel like just all young Africans are asking is just the right to exist on that. So when you do that, when you see French, when you blame French already, where do we go from there? What are the alternatives for young people? So if there is a blockage, does it justify the military coup, for instance? on that. So the military coup could be a transition, a small period of transitions on that. I agree, and you mentioned it on that. But what are also alternatives if young people cannot even manifest outside on the street on that? I'm just circling here. I knock wood. Mark my words, Senegal will be the next. I'm saying it, I'm from Senegal, but I need to hide behind the desk. But currently, right now, I'm afraid that it will be the next because we have a presidential election in February coming up soon. Yeah. And currently, the situation is Ousmane Sonko, the main political opponent, is in prison, in jail on that. Yeah. Macky Sall was pushed out, not going to do a third term over there, pushed out by Ousmane Sonko and the popular class. But he has resentment, he has hate, and he doesn't want to let go really. He said he's going to go, but people guess that he's not really, because he wants just to manage to have an invisible hand behind on that. So what I'm suspecting here is there is an uncertainty that might lead to military coup even in Senegal if Ousmane Sonko is not part of the elections, the main opponent on that. So that's the current state of Senegal right now. That's why I knock wood and I said that Senegal, mark my word, you might say Ousmane said it already. Senegal is going to be the next on that. And I'm going to just to finish here with last. You said it's funny that almost funny, like you said, dynasty democracy, like authoritarian democracy. If you think about it, normally democracy should be just democracy. Democracy and dynasty is two different things. You cannot put them together. Authoritarian and democracy, you cannot put them together. So it seems like people are distorting democracy and should be just democracy in using some other kind of combination that doesn't go together even on that. But I'm done, yes, but I know who. So you got
Can I ask a question now?
Okay, we got a follow-up question. Bridget is going to ask her question before we allow Professor Obadare to respond. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so again, thank you for your presentation. My question is about, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the importance of giving leadership to the younger generation, just so we can have that global thing that's happening. Playing devil's advocate, we look here at the United States and we look at people in power, right? From Trump to Biden to Pelosi, Mitch McConnell. Everyone is old, but we do have a system in place that's working for everyone. So based off of your research, is there any tangible results to prove that if younger people have the power, they can make the change that is required? Or, it doesn't really matter the age?
That's a great question. Okay, so I think the age thing is very tricky. Right now, especially if you're in the United States, every day you wake up and you look at President Biden, you think, oh my God, what's going to happen tomorrow? I think so here is where this is problematic in an African context. So think about what connects these countries that I'm going to reel out: Uganda, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, Republic of Congo, Eritrea. I think the average age of the leaders of those countries will be 76, give or take. It's not just that these people are old. It's also that they are training their sons, not daughters. That's also important. It's a different conversation. They are all training their sons to succeed them. So hence the thing about dynastic rule. What having a single person in power for so long does is that it just freezes things in place and robs the vitals of this institution of their dynamism and of their power. It basically makes development almost impossible. Now, what I'm going to try and do for the sake of analysis, what I will encourage us to do, is to separate that from societies where there are older people in power. So there may be a way to separate, for instance, the United States, where clearly you have the Pelosi's of this, who I think she's 83. She's just announced that she's going to run again. President Biden is 82. It looks like he's 125 on a good day. I understand that's a problem. But insofar as the mechanisms to replace those people, I think insofar as those mechanisms are in place and they are working very well, I would not necessarily be opposed to having people like that in power. Oh, by the way, an important footnote here. Sometimes young people's energy is rallied around older people for a reason. So it's not true that young people necessarily want a young person in power. So think about, 10 years ago, the universities across the United States were feeling the burn. Does anybody remember feel the burn? Like, how old is Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders is not a spring chicken, but young people across the United States agreed, felt, had this idea that it was the one who was going to deliver what young people wanted. So and that's not a contradiction. I think my own specific grouse with what we are finding in an African context is leaders just been there for so long, constituting this gerontocratic system that leaves very little in terms of openings for people to either access or to make changes, to the democratic apparatus.
I have a question.
Yeah, I would. We have another question. I'm just going to insert the name of Trump for the dynastic thing, right? You were saying earlier about how, the kind of foreshadowing, we can look to Africa to see the elements of waves in the future. Well, the Trump phenomenon and the younger Trumps coming on might be a counterexample to the other elders you mentioned. But we have a more important question from the room. Yes, please.
Yeah, Prof. I quite agree with your position, though. When it comes to the level of development and let's say administration, that it is justified for the military to take over political power if what we are witnessing in civilian rule is still the case. So I think in the writings of Janowitz and Hotite, let's go back to the theories like the reformative stage of military intervention, that they take over political power and they appreciate the level of development. So does that really exist in theory in itself as opposed to being practical? Is it just a theory that was just put out there that the military they take over political power and they appreciate the level of development and they continue from there? Or going by what we truly know what the military system is characterized with, that all forms of administrative maladies and misconduct, that they won't do anything, that there's no form of development or whatever. So in that case, I think that contradicts Huntington's view when he talked about reformative military, that they take over political power and they appreciate the level of development and they want to do more. So does that theory only come in form of, that postulation, is it only in form of theory or we have it in practice?
So it's a great question. So the answer to that is to think about where that literature is coming from. So there was a time in the 60s and 70s that the so-called man on horseback, right, was a thing. And it was going to come in, ride like a sheriff into town, put things, like, in the Old West, restore law and order, hand down justice, and then ride out, like Clint Eastwood. I think what killed that theory was experience. Right. And practice is a very interesting thing when this is how it's going to pan out. If there is destabilization and instability, you need people from the military to come in and no. Should the military have intervened in January 6, when things seem dicey in the United States? The answer is no. You let the system get stress tested so that it can become stronger. Right? Nietzsche says what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There are days I doubt that, but you get the point. I think the whole thing is that when societies are undergoing stress, you need to go through that and come out on the other side to have for the institutions themselves to be able to say, look, institutions themselves are theoretical frameworks. They are set up to go through certain things. The last thing you want to do is for them to actually not go through those things because you're trying to save the system, right? It's always, the best thing is always to let the system work. So insofar as the old theory around the, and there's a name for it. I'm blocking on the name now. But there's this idea of, the good soldier. If you read the literature in the 60s, 70s, I mean, there's a lot of that. It's about a series of tracts on, this so-called developmental military that was going to right the wrongs in society. I mean, look, again, I'm speaking on the basis of my own experience. This has shaped my own intellectual formation. This is who I am. I have no love for the military at all. In politics, the military's role should be in the barracks, right? It's interesting also. Let me quickly add this, that people are entertaining the idea of the military coming into politics to sort things out. The same military that has failed to do the job it should do on the military stage, right? So think about Niger, think about Guinea, think about Burkina Faso, think about Nigeria and Boko Haram. These are places these are theaters where the military has failed to do its job. So Africa is the only continent right now where the military is saying, think about it, I failed in the role that I was trained to do. Now give me the opportunity to sort out politics. Does that even make any sense?
That's true.
Well, we've gone over the time that we had allotted for the presentations. Thank you. Join me in thanking.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, guys. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
And join us next month, October 10 and November 8. We've got 2 more presentations in the series coming up. Thank you very much.
Before you go, can I say something?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't mean to put Professor Elisha Wren on the spot. I see that she's there. Let me quickly say that I wouldn't be where I am today, but for our support. We've never met in person. You've been of tremendous assistance to me. I really, really appreciate it. I owe you a big hug and pounded yam and a goosey whenever we meet. So that's it. Okay, my nose is brown now. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.